Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have in the studio with us today Dr. Jim Denison. He's been with us before during this hour. He's been on a number of times with us on the Thursdays, but we sort of moved it around a little bit so different people at different hours can have a chance to hear about him, the Denison Forum, the daily article, and much more. And for people that happen to be listening to when we had you on last week, it was last Thursday, we were talking about the topic that was front and center, how Christians can deal with the culture. But you came in with a kind of a news flash, this is just broken, the whole search for a gay gene. And I thought, since we did spend a little time yesterday talking about that with John Stonestreet, but that was in the third hour, and a lot of people this hour don't hear that hour. And since nobody's had a chance to hear your perspective on that, and given the fact that you have a doctorate and a master of divinity, but also have worked quite a bit in this genetics area and have been a pastor in dealing with homosexuality and other topics, I just couldn't wait to see what you would have to say about this today. And if you find yourself saying, okay, he goes through all of that so fast, I'd like to read it slowly. The first article we have here is by Jim Denison from last week. We just entitled it Genetics and Same-Sex Attraction. It's from the August 30th daily briefing. Before we go any further, let's just for a minute mention the daily briefing. It's out every single day, and it gives our listeners a chance to read some of your perspective from a biblical point of view on some of the issues in the news.
Well, thank you, Kerby. So glad to be with you again today. I'm just so honored to be in these conversations with you.
Right.
I've been doing this with you for years, and just so admire your mind and your heart and the privilege of this friendship together. So, yes, each morning we send out what we call the daily article. It's available as a podcast, available as on our website, of course, and then we have about 180,000 subscribers in 203 countries. And so I have it get up about 4:15 in the morning, have it done, and in the technological format that we wish it to be in by around 6. Have an editor that gets up early and helps me with all of that. It's free. Everything we do is free. So our listeners are more than welcome to go to our website, denisonforum.org, where they can read the article for today, where they can subscribe if they wish to do so as well, where they can follow us on an app, or they can follow us through social media. It's available through our Facebook accounts as well and our various platforms, or they can listen to it on our podcast.
And I might just mention that we have a link to this particular article. It came out August 30th. And also, if they click on your picture, they'll find the daily article for today, which has the lead Brad Pitt on pain, grief, and loss, making peace with our past, and some other great material, as well as not only your articles, but you are very good about posting some other people's articles that you found very helpful as well. So it's all at the denisonforum.org. My goal is to get that 180,000 up to 200,000, and so I hope some of you listening right now will take the time to actually sign up. Okay, last Thursday you came in and said, well, I know, Kerby, haven't had a chance to look at this study, but it comes down, and I thought it was interesting because you have, for example, let me use Associated Press, new genetic links to same-sex sexuality found in huge study. That looks like we found something. Fortunately, our friends at NPR said, search for gay genes comes up short in new studies. So the fact that you have this wide diversity of headlines, and I only read two or three out of a dozen or so, there were some people that said, we've now found the genetic link. Most of the others have said, no, it really doesn't say anything of the sort. And it depends on whether you read past the headline, doesn't it?
Really does. And really the agenda that's driven the news is obviously, once again, going to define how the news gets reported and how it gets interpreted. You have to read down at least halfway into, sometimes past halfway, into the articles that I saw on Wall Street Journal, New York Times, before you discover that this is nothing of the sort, such as the headline might in fact indicate. There's been this massive study done, and in fact a number of those that were leading the effort are themselves gay, and clearly had a personal agenda in the work that they're attempting to do here. They think they have found genetic correlation that could perhaps be 8 to 27% relative to whether an individual has a same-sex attraction, they're saying. But if you keep reading further, you discover that when they look at the genome of an individual, that percentage is less than 1% for an individual. And even if you go to the 27%, or they postulate perhaps 32%, if you move past what they can research and discuss, that's two-thirds of a person's individual sexual identity that has nothing to do with any kind of genetic component whatsoever. Yeah. And so even if you give them the biggest number that's possible in this, it's obvious that the genetic components of this are not the main drivers. There's not been a gay gene discovered, and those of us that have been working in genetics for years could have told you that.
Yes.
That behavior such as this and issues such as sexual identity have so little to do with genetic components, and the components are so complex. If we're just talking about eye color or height or hair color, The genetics behind all of that are enormously complex. Then when we get to things such as sexual identity and sexual behavior and preference, the nature-nurture issue is going to be part of the discussion forever. There's never going to be a time that gets resolved through some kind of simple scientific formula.
And used one example. This comes from the death of the gay gene. This person said if you look at one of those genes, RS347300229, it says possibly they think it increases the chances of having a same-sex sexual experience by 0.4%. That sounds really small to me. And again, it also suggests that those genes might affect sex hormones, the sense of smell, a variety of other things. And so you've worked in the area of genetics, and as a matter of fact, have done ethical counseling in that regard. It seems to me that we tend to believe that so much is due to nature, and yet it really is a lot of nature and nurture, isn't it?
It really is, yeah. I've been in the space relative to medical ethics for years. I've been able to serve as resident scholar for ethics with Baylor Scott and White Health, and what moved me into that position really was my interest in genetics and genetic discovery. Some years ago, I was on the board of what was then the Baylor healthcare system. We'd read a book on genomics and genetics by Francis Collins. At one of our board retreats, I was so fascinated by what I read that I said too much about it the next day, and I wound up being the chairman of a task force. That's how it works in organizational life, as you know. Wound up chairing a task force that would look at how Baylor could respond to the opportunities of genomics relative to medicine, and that led to the creation of a genetic medicine branch really for us at Baylor, where we're seeking to look at ways that we can do what's called personalized medicine, or sometimes called precision medicine, and take advantage of the opportunities from genetic research relative to diagnosis, treatment, and prevention. Not just relative to sexual identity, of course, but relative to the broad spectrum of medical treatment. And so I've been in that space for probably 7 or 8 years now, working in this area. It's fascinating in the context of God's design, the complexity of design, and the fact that these genetic components relative to behavioral issues are really a very small part of the puzzle.
And I had a geneticist on last week just before you were there, and one of the things we talked about is just how complex genetics is. We used to think that there were a lot of what's so-called junk DNA because it didn't seem to have any function. Well, if you start from an evolutionary point of view, you would just assume that that's just the leftover. That's the flotsam and jetsam from a previous evolutionary experiment that went nowhere. But if you start with the idea that we're created in God's image and there's value and dignity in human beings, as they started looking at that, go, wait a minute. That actually is not junk DNA. It's actually very important as well. And we began to realize that this simple kind of linear view of genetics and no other gene affects no other gene was terribly simplistic. And so after the break, I want you to educate us on that. But also, as we talk about this idea of the gay gene, there were some interesting things that did surface. And again, it illustrates, I think, perhaps better than any, some of the the conversation we've had here. A lot of science has been co-opted by political correctness. You know, you're not allowed to disagree with global warming. You're not allowed to suggest there's not a gay gene. You're not allowed to say, maybe there's evidence for intelligent design rather than evolution. And I think this one illustrates that one more time. So we are privileged to have with us today Dr. Jim Denison. Let me encourage you during the break to go to the Denison Forum. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the opioid crisis is getting worse, but there is also good evidence that solving this crisis will require careful strategies because the problem is more complex than many might imagine. First, let's look at the crisis. Americans are showing up in emergency rooms from opioid overdoses in record numbers. According to the CDC, suspected opioid overdoses increased by 30% from July 2016 to September 2017. But as soon as you look at the statistics in various states, you see how complex this issue is to solve with a simple solution. For example, prescription opioids are driving the epidemic in some states. In other states, illicit opioids are driving the epidemic, and in a few states, it is both. That is only part of the complexity. Opioids, when used correctly, can be highly effective pain medications. They can make the difference between a functional life and a dysfunctional life. Jacob Sullum writes about how doctors are tired of the scrutiny and have booted all of their opioid patients and relegated them to a pain-racked existence. His article in Reason magazine challenges the current perception that the use of opioids always leads to addiction and death. He explains that opioid-related deaths do not usually involve drug-naive patients who accidentally get hooked while being treated for pain. Instead, they usually involve people with histories of substance abuse and psychological problems who use multiple drugs, not just opioids. He argues that we should not conflate the two groups, opioid addicts and patients using opioids responsibly under a doctor's care. We need wise and careful policies to both treat the epidemic, but also help patients dealing with chronic pain. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have in studio with us today Jim Denison. And by the way, if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. But if not, just sit back and listen. And first of all, we have a link to this whole conversation about genetics and same-sex attraction. But I thought here is a good illustration of how sometimes political correctness is superimposed upon science. I just illustrated one example of that, and that is you can find everything. Let me give some others. Wall Street Journal, research finds genetic links to same-sex behavior. And, of course, I mentioned others. Science News, there's no evidence that a gay gene exists. So you get all over the map on that. But here, Jim, is one of the other things I thought about, and that is when they were looking at the studies, they recognized that there seemed to not only be a correlation, a very small one, and correlation is not causation, between these genes and subsequent same-sex attraction, but a correlation between that and really dangerous kind of risky behavior. Now, I love at least the article I have in the New York Times, which quickly dismisses that by saying, well, that could simply be the stress of enduring societal pressure. So even though we see the possibility that these genes might also be associated with risk behavior and risk of kinds of activities and depression and loneliness and all the other things that were listed, there's certainly no possibility that correlates at all with homosexuality, unless you read Romans 1, right?
Exactly. And as you read Romans 1, then you really see how God looks at this, and therefore how we have to look at this. But it really is so conflicted, in some ways contradictory, isn't it? That on the one side, this genetic science could perhaps indicate a propensity toward same-sex attraction, but on the other side, it certainly doesn't indicate any kind of causality relative to risk behavior, and it's the same data applied in two completely different ways. We've seen this over the years, haven't we? There was a study done some years ago of the hypothalamuses of the cadavers.
Simon LeVay,
who went into that experiment saying if he could not prove a physical causality relative to homosexuality, he would get out of science, demonstrating he was anything but objective about the work that he was doing as he came into this. And so he found that the hypothalamuses of some that he believed were related to cadavers that perhaps had some kind of same-sex attraction, were therefore indicating some kind of causality here. And someone came along and said, well, how do we know that the homosexual behavior didn't cause the change in the size of the hypothalamus?
Yeah.
And he had no response for that.
Yeah.
He had come into it with such a bias as regards what this must be. The same with this. The immediate response of the Times is, well, there's so much oppression that people that live in a same-sex kind of attraction have to deal with. That could explain this. Well, when you go to Denmark and Sweden and places that have been legitimizing and endorsing same-sex behavior for decades, you still find extremely high levels of suicide and depression issues and issues relative to same-sex behavior that can't be explained by social pressure, because that's in a culture where that pressure doesn't exist, hasn't existed for decades. So clearly the agenda by which the person comes to the science makes the outcome less than scientific.
In the few times I've had a chance to talk about that issue of homosexuality, you go back to that Simon LeVay story. That was front page news, and it was covered by all the media and everything. And then people went back and said, now, wait a minute. The correlation is not very strong at all. As a matter of fact, the deviation is larger than the correlation. And I was forced to take enough statistics classes to know that when that's the case, there's really nothing there. But back to the point you made just a minute ago, a chicken or an egg. Is it the behavior that caused the brain, or is it the brain that caused the behavior? Well, I think, first of all, that study has been completely set aside. But even if you could prove some of that, how much of that, especially when you're talking about brain, since our brains are plastic, we talk about neuroplasticity and things like that. Could you explain it? And back to your other point, which I thought is even more striking, we keep hearing that, the reason transgender people are upset, the reason homosexual people in America are upset is because of the incredible bias against them. Well, we've had a social experiment going on in the Nordic countries and in Switzerland and a variety of other places that have been very, very sympathetic and non-judgmental, mostly. I mean, you go to Amsterdam, find anybody that has a bias against homosexuality, and yet the suicide rate is still there as well. So you do get this sense that the worldview, which is something you and I talk about almost every day, did affect this. And just before we take a break, I thought there was just one other one that I just could not resist. And that is, what was so striking is that just before this was published, and I only found this out, interestingly enough, in the Time, or I guess it was the New York Times Magazine, is that in order to consider how to actually begin to portray this, there was an attempt to actually go to LGBTQ groups so that they could clarify the wording and highlight all the caveats. Now, you have certainly been around scientists and scientific studies enough to know I can't think of another time when before you publish a scientific study, you go and talk to all the advocacies groups first before you try to even write your piece and publicize it. That's something very unusual.
I had never seen that before, really on any level relative to the objectivity that science is supposed to work within in order to be believable and repeatable. If, in fact, there had been such a concern that this information, when it's made public, could cause difficulty for those in the LGBT community, then I would want to come along and ask, well, what about the evangelical community? What about those that for years have been saying that actually God's intention for us is that we be man and woman in a covenant marriage? Wouldn't you want to come to those communities as well? If, in fact, you're concerned about the fallout of this, you're concerned about the repercussions for people in these communities, why did you only go to the LGBTQ communities to get those advocacy groups on board, or at least get their input before you make this public, rather than being more even-handed? And really, from a scientific perspective, is that the job of the scientist? Isn't the job of the scientist to do the investigation and report the findings, and then let the culture interpret that as they wish, rather than allowing the culture into the prism by which the objectivity is therefore flawed?
Yeah,
it just was a thing I'd never seen before.
I'd never seen it before either, and I think it's just another good illustration of how some of these kind of worldview issues have really begun to affect the way in which science is done. And I thought, just before we take a break, let's talk about something else, because this also illustrates why there is such a kind of draw in the Christian community. Let me just pick Joshua Harris as one example. We've had a couple of high-profile individuals who have sort of said, I'm leaving the Christian faith. And a week ago, I did a whole thing on contradictions in the Bible because of a Hillsong singer who said, well, nobody talks about the contradictions. Well, we do. But I think for Joshua Harris, the issue is LGBTQ. In other words, if I have a gay friend, or I see some other gay friends, and if sometimes maybe they have been maybe a little bit mistreated by the church, and I am convinced that you're born gay and there's not a thing you can do about it, which is exactly what this study was supposed to try to prove, does that not just peel off some of these Christian people, high-profile people, as well as other Christian kids that go off to the university?
You saw that with Jen Hatmaker. a few years ago. She and her husband came to that same position. We're seeing that especially in a millennial context. This idea, unfortunately, that one's social or sexual orientation is to be treated as though this were a civil rights issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I, as a pastor, am unwilling to marry a same-sex couple, that's the same thing as if I weren't willing to marry an African-American couple.
Right.
And so this is the civil rights issues of our day, just like that was in the 60s. And if I come down to what I think is so clearly the biblical position on this, I'm somehow being discriminatory, I'm homophobic, I'm bigoted, I'm prejudiced. And if that's the evangelical response, I can't be an evangelical anymore. I'm seeing other people that don't want to call themselves evangelical for that very reason, because they don't want to be identified with what's considered to be a bigoted, prejudiced, narrow-minded sort of point of view. Well, we've been here before. We've been here through history. Whenever Christians have attempted to stand up and speak for biblical morality and biblical truth, there's always been this kind of pushback. In the Roman Empire, for those that would stand up and say that women ought to be treated as being equally valuable to men, that was heresy in the day in the culture, when a man might have one wife and 10 concubines. In a day when we believe that children ought not to be abandoned if they're unwanted, and we go out and we'd rescue these babies from the trash heaps, there were people saying that's ridiculous. The child belongs to the parent, and patria potesta, and the father can do whatever they want. In the Roman era, we were considered to be cannibals because we thought about the blood of Jesus symbolically in the Lord's Supper. We were thought to be libertarians because we would minister to prostitutes. And so there's just always been a time when if we'll stand for biblical truth, those that are opposed to biblical truth will be opposed to us.
Yes. And again, if you want to read more about that, we've talked about the book, The Triumph of Christianity. We've talked about, of course, just yesterday, of course, we had John Stonestreet on, talked about Chuck Colson, some of those individuals. When we come back from the break, I want to spend a little bit more time talking about, in light of this, how do we talk to individuals that say, well, I'm a homosexual? Because we have pastors listening, we have other people that have parents and those kinds of things. This seems to set aside the idea that I was born gay. But still, there are going to be a lot of people that will say that. And then the other one, once gay, always gay. Well, I can't change. Well, that's kind of changing, too, because the transgender people are saying, well, no, sexuality is fluid. So those are two remarkable changes in the debate. But again, how do we reach out to those individuals? And I have across from me here a man that served as a pastor and a seminary professor, and he brings a tremendous amount of godly wisdom in that regard. So I think you will benefit from him as well. And if you'd like to know more about the Denison Forum, we have a link on our website, pointofview.net. And I would encourage you to sign up for the daily article. We will come back and have a conversation with him right after this.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today. In studio with us, Dr. Jim Denison, and we have a link, Jim, to the Denison Forum. So let's, for just a minute, before we get into some other application, because you're all about application and so am I, the fact that you've got all sorts of great resources. First of all, of course, the daily article shows up. I have a lot of the Denison articles and books in front of me here as well, from you and from your sons and even your wife and others. But first of all, the thing I would encourage people to do is go down about 2/3 along the page. There's a place where you can enter your email and receive the daily article, Monday through Friday, and then a Saturday summary. Talk about what's available when people do that.
Yeah, thanks so much. So there's an article each morning that we put out by around 6 or so. The podcast version is usually up by 6:30 or so. I get up that morning early and either rewrite or start over or edit something that I've looked at previously, and we'll make that into an email. It goes out as an email template. It's also available on the website. It's available on all of our various social media platforms as well, and it's available as a podcast. And that's 5 days a week. And then we do a summary of all of that on Saturday, where a person can go back and get links to each of the previous articles. And we also have links to a number of videos that I've recorded over the years. I've been in studio answering questions people ask, various questions about the faith. We've put together a series called Biblical Insights to Tough Questions, and we have 3 volumes of that already done. We're working on the 4th volume right now, and there's a video component behind a lot of that. We have a number of podcasts that are available in that space as well, and then a number of books that I've done over the years, 15 or so books that I've written over the years, and a lot of that's available through the website also.
Anybody watching, we have, the Blessed, and of course the Critical Issues, and How Does God See America, those 3 volumes set. And of course there's podcasts. There is a YouTube channel. And so there are just a lot of ways to get great insight from Jim Denison. And let's get some more of that insight from you right now as we say, how do you respond to somebody that says, well, I have same-sex attraction, or I'm gay, whatever they say? And as a pastor, you had to think about this. I put a chapter in one of my books years ago on what a pastor would say when somebody comes into the counseling room and says, I'm gay. What do you say? Get some thoughts.
It's a question that I wasn't prepared for the first time it came. It was many years ago. This was way back before all of this conversation became anything like as public as it is. And had a person that came to me. I was pastoring a very large church, and this person made an appointment to come to see me. And turned out the reason that they said they were there wasn't at all the reason they needed to be there. They just felt like they could trust me. We'd been friends for a long enough period. And they felt like they could just say to me that they had this enormous struggle in their lives, and it was something they so desperately wanted to change and didn't know how to change, and I didn't know where they were going. And they said, the problem is that I'm attracted to men. I really have a sexual attraction to men. And he was married at the time. I had a family. And he said, I feel this attraction to men, and I don't know what to do about this. Is God punishing me? Is God judging me? Am I going to go to hell? Can I be a Christian? Can I really have a relationship with God? He just couldn't have been more confused about all of that. And I tried to say to him then 3 things that I would say to anybody in this conversation. I've had this conversation so many times since as a pastor and in various other kind of formats and that sort of thing. The first thing I would want to say is homosexual activity is unbiblical. Wherever Scripture speaks of homosexual activity, it speaks of it as the wrong thing, as the thing that God does not intend for us. That is not the way God designed our lives. Frankly, it's not the way God designed our bodies. We could talk about the physiology of that and the enormous damage that is done to bodies through same-sex activity. It's not how God intends us to be in social relationships with others. First of all, it's not God's biblical lifestyle for us. Second, this is not the unpardonable sin. There are other sins, that, for instance, 1 Corinthians 6, where there's a whole litany of sins, homosexuality among them, and homosexual behavior, and it says, and such were some of you. But you were redeemed, you were washed, you were saved, you were transformed. This is not the unpardonable sin. And the third point I want to make is God has hope for you.
Right.
There are ways God redeems all that he allows. And God can redeem this in so many different ways. I've known people over the years, Kerby, I know this isn't popular to say today, but I've known people over the years that through counseling, through prayer, through experience in their own lives have genuinely seen their orientation change.
Right.
They would say to you today, I did have a same-sex attraction. That attraction is gone for me. I no longer feel that. I no longer have that. I have a heterosexual attraction, and that was a former life, and it's just not there anymore. That's absolutely the story that I can give you examples after example of people like that. I've known other people who would say to you that they still have a same-sex attraction, so they've chosen to be celibate.
Right.
They've chosen not to
talk
act
about
on
that in your article. Yeah.
Those are some of my heroes.
Mm-hmm.
People that have chosen to be celibate. I can't imagine how difficult that would be, but they've chosen to be celibate rather than act on what they believe to be an unbiblical vestige of the fall, the fact that we're all broken sexually. And then the third way that God redeems this is when people have been through something like this and God's been able to work in their lives, they're able to help other people. I'm thinking about a man right now, a friend of mine, that leads a ministry to people that have been involved in a gay lifestyle. Thousands that he's been able to help over the years. He came out of a gay lifestyle himself.
Mm-hmm.
And he, as long as he lives, he's happily married, but he will tell you that he's tempted by homosexual behavior, just as I am tempted heterosexually. I've been married for 39 years, but I didn't stop noticing women when I married my wife. I just choose not to go down that road. I choose not to act on an impulse or an idea or a temptation. I choose to stay in a celibate kind of sexuality, except with my wife. That's a decision that all of us make, because all of us are broken sexually. Heterosexual sin, homosexual sin is still sin.
That's right.
All of us are broken sexually, and God redeems and can redeem any life that's trusted to him.
This idea then, as such were some of you, just love that in 1 Corinthians, so certainly that shows the possibility of hope. But you said something in passing, and we might pick up on, and that is the difference between temptation and sin. There are some Christians I've run into over the years that say, well, if you feel the temptation, well, that's sin. I'm going, well, okay. In Hebrews, it says Jesus was tempted like us in all ways. Right. Was Jesus sinful? That usually is the deal breaker real quick. They go, okay, maybe not. But there is a real possibility here that you can feel the temptation but not actually act upon that. You know, the old Martin Luther quote of, the birds will fly around my head, but I don't have to build a nest on my head is a good illustration of that. And it seems to me that we need to understand that and communicate that in the church, because I still think there's a fuzziness about thinking about that, isn't there?
I agree. It seems to some pastors, I think, that they're endorsing homosexual behavior if they say to a person a homosexual orientation or a same-sex attraction is not the sin. The sin is acting on that attraction. They may be afraid that they're endorsing something when actually what they're doing is being biblical about this. As we discussed, each of the 6 or 7 places that Scripture speaks of homosexual sin, it always speaks of it in the act of the sin, in the living out of that. And in that expression of that desire, that attraction, is where the sin is found, not in the feeling, not in the attraction itself. I've known people over the years that have told me as long as they can remember, they've always felt an attraction to the same sex. I've known others who could tell you the time in their life when they really began moving in that direction. I was talking to a group of college ministers recently, and they were describing the real difficulty on college campuses today where a person comes out and they're treated like a hero. They're treated like a martyr. They're celebrated. And so there's an attraction to people that feel a little outside. They're lonely. They don't have a room. They don't have a place. They don't have a community. And they feel welcomed by a gay community. And so they move into a gay lifestyle when years earlier they would never have said that they had a gay attraction or a same-sex attraction. And so really it's a spectrum here. At one point it was believed that as much as 28% of individuals when they're in teenage years might have some vestige of a same-sex attraction. But if that's left alone, if they're allowed simply to move forward with their lives, it'll settle into the 4%. That is what the research indicates today. Right. The problem we have is we come along and we say, if a person has any same-sex thought, oh, you must be gay.
You must be, yeah.
You must therefore come out of the closet. You must only be that. You must always be that. You must embrace this community and this activism and this lifestyle. When, as you said earlier, the transgender would say, no, it's fluid. But that doesn't apply to this, unfortunately, in the mindset.
And the arrow only goes one direction. There is a court case that we're going to be talking about here in a few weeks with Matt Staver, where they say that anybody who tries to counsel an individual that has same-sex attraction into traditional sexuality, that is not only illegal, but it's criminal. But at the same time, they've actually funded individuals that will counsel young people who, if they wonder if they're homosexual, can go. So the arrow only is allowed to go in one direction, which I think we can talk about a little bit more. But we need to take one of those breaks. But when we come back, I thought we might also focus on how we might ask questions. You know, when I see Jesus, he asks a lot of questions. And just the other day, somebody said, well, if you were with a homosexual, what questions would you ask? And I said, well, tell me about your family, because as you and I both know, some of the individuals that we've had a chance to on this program interview that left the homosexual lifestyle actually were in homes that were sort of that classic triadic situation that Sigmund Freud talks about, where you had the dominant mother and the passive or absent father, and then the individual. Now, does that explain everything? No. Human sexuality is too complex, but it's interesting to hear how sometimes there's a little bit of self-discovery as you just listen to their story. Or maybe they tell you that they experimented at a very young age sexually, and then they started moving in that direction. So sometimes even by asking questions, being willing to listen, and really showing grace, I think we can sometimes help individuals, and if nothing else, there will be an opportunity to share the gospel. But I want to hear your comments, and so when we come back from the break, we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that. And before we're done, I want to get some other thoughts on if anybody has questions about genetics or genetic counseling or those kinds of things. I want to also encourage them to contact you at the Denison Forum. So we'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with, again, our good friend Jim Denison. And if you would like to know more about the Denison Forum, it's available on our website, pointofview.net. And one of the things that I think has been really helpful sometimes, Jim, is to answer questions, but sometimes just to ask questions. And do you have any thoughts about that? Because it seems to me that sometimes if you're a parent, a pastor, a youth leader, whatever, and somebody says that, you're sort of like, okay, there's some things you just said. It's not the unpardonable sin and God loves you and all those kinds of things. But I think there's a good place in just simply saying, tell me your story. How'd you come to this?
Absolutely. That's one of the things that we hear back from people, whether it's LGBTQ individuals or people that are in other places in their lives. They often say that they're unheard. They feel that the church
Right.
doesn't care about their story, that the church wants to preach to them more than it wants to listen to them. Well, when you follow the model of Jesus, he was just the opposite, wasn't he? You think about John 4 and the woman at the well, and how Jesus started with water and was able to lead her to living water. You think all through Scripture how Jesus is so incarnational, not only obviously in his ministry, but in his ministry practice, how he starts where you are. He starts with the felt need and leads to the spiritual need. And so in these conversations, we ask people, what is your story? What is your background? Tell me about your family. Tell me about the experiences that you've had along the way. Tell me about the hard parts. Tell me about the pain. Tell me about the places where you feel the church has not treated you well, has not treated you appropriately.
Very good.
And let's have an opportunity to talk about that. And if necessary, to apologize. An opportunity to say there are people that sometimes speak in the name of God, but don't speak in the Spirit of God. Those people that'll be picketing a funeral and be saying all fags go to hell and all of that horrific stuff that is sometimes out there that the media will say represents evangelical Christianity, doesn't represent evangelical Christianity. And sometimes just being able to say that to people, hearing their stories, asking their questions, and being able to speak the truth in love is the answer.
So again, if you want to find some great insight in this particular area, go to, again, the Denison Forum and this article from August 30th on the new study, and also goes into a couple of other things on how you would respond. But I would be remiss if I didn't have you tell us a little bit more about this area of genetics, because this is a developing field. You know, back when I wrote about it more than 30 years ago, we had artificial insemination, we had a little bit of artificial sex selection, we talked about doing some gene editing, but now with things like CRISPR and a variety of others, there are just a great deal of questions that are being asked, not only in the area of genetic engineering, but also artificial reproduction. And I'm hoping people will contact you if they've got those questions, but give us some guidelines. It seems to me that we start with the idea that individuals, even conceiving in the womb, are certainly valuable, created in the image of God. So we don't want to destroy embryos. But at the same time, if we can treat and eventually cure genetic diseases, that's redeeming some of the physical effects of the fall. And I think that's certainly biblical, isn't it?
Absolutely, and is consistent with medicine as we've understood it across the millennia. Really, I think this works on stages. When we think of it, when I do talks on this and presentations, we think about genetics relative, first of all, prior to conception, where we're thinking about in vitro, we're thinking about the possibilities that exist to be able to help couples conceive that could not otherwise. My advice to people is if they choose to use in vitro fertilization, that they implant every embryo that they create. That they not fertilize embryos that they intend to freeze or they intend to use for medical research or some such as that, because I believe life begins at conception, and I believe that these are lives that we're creating here. I would suggest that if they do what's called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where they're investigating the viability of these embryos before they're implanted, that the researchers do no more than investigate relative to viability. They're not looking at gender, they're not looking at diseases, they're looking only at the viability of the embryo itself. And in so doing, we can use genetic testing to help couples have children that would not otherwise. Now you're thinking about the baby in the womb. There is an enormous kind of variety of genetic tests that are now available relative to helping parents understand the health issues that their child might in fact be facing. If we're doing genetic testing, what we're not doing is doing this so we can decide whether or not to abort the child.
Right.
Because life begins at conception, and every life is sacred, from conception to natural death. What we might be doing is looking for ways that medical intervention could be helpful. For instance, it's possible to do heart valve surgery on embryos or fetuses in the mother's womb.
It's just amazing.
It's astounding,
High
isn't
tech.
it? We can discover that if a child has a propensity toward obesity, for instance, through genetic profile, that we're going to treat dietary issues for that child from birth differently than we would otherwise. If we discover that there's a propensity for spina bifida, let's say, then we want to be prepared for that, and sometimes can do repair even in the womb. And so there are medical options, as you say, that exist at that point. And then the third stage, of course, is birth forward. At this point, we're doing genetic testing both to prevent disease, to treat disease, and to diagnose. Cancer, as one quick example, is a category. There's no such thing as cancer, just like there's no such thing as leaves. There's just this leaf and this leaf and this leaf. There's this kind of breast cancer, that kind of colon cancer. There are actually 10 categories of breast cancer. There are 5 categories of colon cancer. Well, previously we had to treat cancer within categories. whether that's chemotherapy or radiation. It's kind of like carpet bombing, where we're hoping to kill the cancer cell, but so much negative that comes from that. With genetic capacities, now we can get to the specific genomic signature of that particular cancer.
Right.
And we can treat
Targeted.
that cancer. We can target it
Yeah.
with personalized or precision medicine in a way we never could before. It's really a revolutionary move. Francis Collins says that genomic medicine is the greatest advance since Leonardo.
Yeah.
And in many ways, it truly is. And so we're using genetic means to diagnose, to prevent, and to treat, but always within the context of the sanctity of life.
You know, I mentioned that when my book came out 30 years ago, I at the time thought we'd be talking about genetics, because that's really the title of the book. I had a chapter there on in vitro fertilization, one of the first people to ever write on that subject. And what I found very quickly is they weren't calling me and writing me about genetics. The modern day Hannahs were saying, I'm infertile. What is permissible? And it does seem to me that one of the things I want to pass on to any of our listeners, if you're a pastor, look out in front of your congregation, think of all the couples. Probably 10% of those couples are infertile. So they're thinking about things like artificial insemination. They're thinking about in vitro fertilization. They're thinking about surrogate parenting, all sorts of things. And so I would really hope that you would contact the Denison Forum and Jim Denison, who's been spending so much time and energy in that area to think about that. And again, I recognize that these are new technologies, but still the biblical principles apply. One biblical principle I've heard you talk about, of course, is the sanctity of human life. And from the moment of conception to death, these are human beings. Another one, which I will put on the table, is the moral integrity of the family. Now, you might say, where do you get that from the Bible? Well, Abraham and Sarah came up with the best artificial reproductive technology of the day. How's that working out for them? Not so well. And so you can see that when you bring a third party into the pregnancy, surrogate parenting, frozen embryos, hundreds of thousands now, and those kinds of things, just all sorts of things develop. So these biblical principles applied to modern technology are really something that I know you're doing there at the Denison Forum, aren't you?
Well, that's one of the areas that really fascinates me as regards where we are and where we're going with all of this. And we really have outstripped our ethics. That's true of so much of medical technology, but especially these days in genetics. We're often saying we have to have some kind of north on the compass. We have to have some kind of moral foundation and worldview by which to do this. Or was the Chinese researcher wrong when he wanted to work in the space of cloning children?
Yes.
Is it wrong to clone organs? Is it wrong to create, as it were, a kind of a parking lot of organs available to you as a donor down in the future? Would it someday be appropriate for us to introduce germline genetic modification so that we could try to abolish sickle cell or Fragile X without knowing the consequence of all of that? Would we someday want to be able to use selective genetic technology to abolish Down syndrome? In Iceland, for instance, Down syndrome is nearly eradicated by virtue of all this. The unintended consequences of what we don't know. It's so important we do all of this through a biblical prism.
And again, you see some of these science fiction films like Gattaca or The Island or some of these others, and you just think, oh, that's all science fiction. But a lot of it's become science fact, and we need to think about this biblically. And that's why I just so encourage you to go to the denisonforum.org, put in your email there. You'll get the daily article, and you'll hear all sorts of great insight every day from Jim Denison. So it is always great to have you here. And I know you've had a busy day, but thank you for giving us an entire hour here.
What a privilege, Kerby. God bless.
Going to take a break, and when we come back, Robert Wolgemuth will be with us. Lies Men Believe. You might remember his wife wrote Lies Women Believe, so we'll be talking about that right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to cover a number of different topics over the next 2 hours. This first hour, we're going to spend some time talking about some of the issues facing men, and we're going to use the book Lies Men Believe to kind of get that conversation started. And then next hour, we're going to get into some of the issues in the news. And the author of this book is somebody who's been on the program with us before, and somebody we've been very familiar with over the years, Robert Wolgemuth, who, of course, was one of the former presidents of Thomas Nelson, and even many of us remember Wolgemuth and Hyatt as a publishing house, owner of Wolgemuth and Associates. You perhaps are familiar with many of his books. She Calls Me Daddy, God Through Time and Eternity, The Most Important Place on Earth. And this one we're going to talk about, Lies Men Believe. But I might also mention that just 2 days ago, as I understand, Moody also released another book, which we'll probably be talking about in the future, which is the first book that he has done with his wife, Nancy Lee DeMoss, so now Nancy DeMoss Wolgemuth, and it's entitled You Can Trust God to Write Your Story. So we'll mention that a little bit later, but I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about this book that has been out for some time. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link so that you can get it either in hardback or in Kindle. And, of course, we also have a link to his website, so all of it is available at our website, pointofview.net. Robert, it is just great to have you back here on Point of View.
Yeah. Hey, Kerby, I'm exhausted. After all that, I'm exhausted. I need to go take a nap.
Okay, I'll let you take a nap, and I'll see if I kind of cover here for a few minutes.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to make sure we covered all the bases.
Thank you for your kind words. It's great to be on the radio with you today, my friend.
Let's mention the book is in some respects reminding me of course, your wife, and that is, everybody is very familiar with that book that came out many years ago. And it is entitled Lies Women Believe. It came out, then there was an updated and expanded version of that. So given the fact that you two now are married, it was almost natural that you would come out with one that focused on the men. Yeah. But talk about both of them for just a minute, if you might, because, you know, just the incredible ministry that her book has had over the years, hasn't it?
It's true, and we still hear from people all over the world. It's been translated into a number of different languages. It was actually first published in 2001, and then, as you said, has been updated. In fact, this summer that I was writing Lies Men Believe, Nancy was updating Lies Women Believe, and so we actually spent a summer on the deck writing lies. People would say, well, what are you guys doing? We said, well, we're writing lies. But you're right, the book has had a remarkable run. As you know, books tend to spike and then die. But this book has been selling really more copies year after year for the whole 15, 17 years that it's been in print. So it's quite a deal. And actually, you're right. It does sound kind of normal that if Nancy's going to marry an author and he's looking for things to do, she might invite him to write the counterpart to Lies Women Believe. And actually, she told me that over the years, various authors had approached her and said, I think you ought to let me write this counterpart, the men's side of Lies Women Believe. And she said, I just never felt right about it. And it wasn't because she was looking forward to getting married. In fact, when I proposed to Nancy in May of 2015, I said, I'd love for you to have, and she said yes, very gratefully. I said, I'd love for you to have the wedding of your dreams. And she looked at me and she said, you know, I've never dreamed about a wedding.
Yes.
The truth is that this very gifted, very special woman felt called to be in ministry as a single woman. She was a champion of marriage, but it really never was on her radar to get married. And then along came Robert. That sounds like an old association song. Remember, then along came Mary. Well, this time it was Robert, and we knew each other professionally.
We're all smiling around the table here. We love that.
Good.
Yeah, it's so good.
And and so I knew her professionally. Actually introduced to her by our mutual friend Henry Blackaby.
Oh, sure.
Who thought Nancy needed an agent. So 2003, 2004, I worked with her on all of her publishing contracts. And then there was a guy on her team who was at her side relative to contracts, and I kind of showed him the ropes and taught him stuff. And I did such a great job that she let me go.
Oh, no.
So I only worked for her for 2 years. Yeah, it's true. So actually, when she introduced me at Revive 15, her conference in front of 3,000 of our closest friends, she said, I may be the only person who hired, fired, and married her agent.
Such a great line.
And the ladies at the conference thought that was pretty special.
Yep. It makes us all smile.
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad. I want you to smile. So, yes, this book came out of the success of Lives Women Believe. And as you said, Lives Women, I believe, has had a huge ministry. Now there's Lives Young Women Believe and Lives Girls Believe with a Mom's Guide. And all three of those books have done so very well. So I stepped up, and Nancy and I walked through the outline together. She's brilliant, honestly. I know she's my wife, and every guy thinks his wife is brilliant, but it's true this time.
She is.
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
So she helped. We worked on the outline together, and it parallels Lives Women Believe. But then what she can't do is write as a man and write to men. And that was a great privilege. I've had the privilege of writing a few books aimed at men, and I love to write, and I love doing that. That feels like a call to me, to write in a way that men understand and men turn the pages. A lot of books, I don't know about you, but a lot of books in my library have a boarding pass about 15% of the way in, and I'm never going back to it. A book is a challenging thing to undertake, and you know this. You're an author.
Sure.
So no adult reads a book because it's been assigned to them. They read it because they enjoy reading it, and they turn the page to keep going. I mean, if you're in church, I hate to say this, but if you're in church, let's say it's a guest pastor and he's not very stem winding, you're going to get up. You're not going to get up and leave. You're going to stay there. You're going to get out your cell phone and work through your schedule for the week or whatever. But a book, if it doesn't capture you, you're going to close the cover and put it away. You're never going to go back to it, and you don't feel bad about doing that.
Yeah, like you said, you got boarding passes in the third chapter. Yeah, and it didn't get any further.
That's right.
Yeah, that's right.
That's it. So the great challenge of writing is, in many ways, to dare the reader to keep going. So, the book Lives Men Believe has lots of stories and lots of ways for men to identify.
Lots of stories,
right?
Yeah.
From the very beginning, I've considered this to be a conversation and not a book at all.
Let me take a break because we're coming to one of those mandatory breaks. You've done enough radio to know that, but I might just mention that it's endorsed by a lot of people that have been on the program with us. Bob Lapine and Tim Challies and George Grant. Patrick Morley actually does the introduction and the forward there, and of course we've enjoyed having him on the years, Jack Graham, and of course Nancy DeMoss Wolgemuth. And so when we come back, we're going to spend a little bit of time working our way through it. There's 11 chapters. There's kind of an introductory chapter and then about 8 that really get into those very significant lies that men believe, and then some follow-up material on walking in truth. If you're a man, you want this book. If you are doing men's ministry, you need this book. And if you're a woman trying to figure out men, you'll want the book too. So let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the opioid crisis is getting worse, but there is also good evidence that solving this crisis will require careful strategies because the problem is more complex than many might imagine. First, let's look at the crisis. Americans are showing up in emergency rooms from opioid overdoses in record numbers. According to the CDC, suspected opioid overdoses increased by 30% from July 2016 to September 2017. But as soon as you look at the statistics in various states, you see how complex this issue is to solve with a simple solution. For example, prescription opioids are driving the epidemic in some states. In other states, illicit opioids are driving the epidemic, and in a few states, it is both. That is only part of the complexity. Opioids, when used correctly, can be highly effective pain medications. They can make the difference between a functional life and a dysfunctional life. Jacob Sullum writes about how doctors are tired of the scrutiny and have booted all of their opioid patients and relegated them to a pain-racked existence. His article in Reason magazine challenges the current perception that the use of opioids always leads to addiction and death. He explains that opioid-related deaths do not usually involve drug-naive patients who accidentally get hooked while being treated for pain. Instead, they usually involve people with histories of substance abuse and psychological problems who use multiple drugs, not just opioids. He argues that we should not conflate the two groups, opioid addicts and patients using opioids responsibly under a doctor's care. We need wise and careful policies to both treat the epidemic, but also help patients dealing with chronic pain. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Spending some time today talking our way through this book, Lies Men Believe, forward by Patrick Morley and, of course, written by Robert Wolgemuth. And we're going to look at some of those lies and also encourage you to get a copy of this. Number one, to focus some of those attention areas in your own life, but also for those of you that maybe run a Bible study, a small group, a Bible fellowship. This may be just a great men's study for you, or even just a study for couples to talk about men and some of their issues. And Robert, I guess the first question is the issue of lies. Where do the lies come from? You talk about the fact that it comes from Satan. I noticed even in the endorsement, Jack Graham mentioned the same. These are the lies that are sometimes whispered in the ears of men, aren't they?
Boy, that's the truth. And let's take a journey back to the garden. And in fact, it's interesting when I mentioned that Nancy and I sat down at the beginning of this adventure, and we compared, or we took the outline of Lies Women Believe and said, okay, which of these chapters and lies can we borrow? And there are actually 40 lies that we've listed. So let's use the ones that fit. But what's really the difference? In fact, it's so interesting, isn't it, that the Apostle Paul makes reference to the conversation in the garden between Adam and Eve and Satan. And he says, 1 Timothy, that Adam was deceived. I mean, Eve was deceived, but Adam was not. It says that. So we looked at that, and so Nancy and I said to each other, okay, so what was Adam? If he wasn't deceived, how would you describe what happened to him? And so we prayed about it like crazy, and then we corresponded with some doctrinally sound, theologically astute folks that we both know, And here's what we landed on. See what you think. Our belief is that men have a tendency, you can't make generalizations, but men have a tendency to sin with their eyes open. So, for example, unfortunately, news has crackled in the last years with false people, pastors, ministry leaders, authors who have failed miserably and have lost their church, lost their ministry, whatever. If we'd have a chance, you and I would have a chance to sit down with these men and say, did you know when you were, and fill in the blank, deep into pornography, having an affair, whatever, did you know that you were sinning? Or let's say that you and I are sitting down on a tree stump outside the garden. Of course, there probably weren't stumps there because there were no chainsaws, but let's stay with me. So we're sitting on a tree stump with Adam after the fall, and we're saying, now, Adam, did you know when you took the fruit from your wife and ate it, did you know that you were sinning against God? What would he say?
He'd say yes.
He would say, yeah, you're right. Yeah. I think he would say absolutely. Mm-hmm. As would these pastors who fail, authors, Christian leaders, and so forth. So, all right, so men, you and I, and men who are listening, or the significant others, the women who are listening, sin with their eyes open. So what's going through our minds? Well, early in our marriage, Nancy would say to me, and we've been married, we're about to celebrate our 46th anniversary. We celebrate months. We're trying to catch up to our friends.
Yes, I was going to say 46 months. Yeah,
okay. Month. Yeah. The 14th of every month is an anniversary.
Okay.
So I'm living in the home that she built 25 years ago. I had homes in Orlando and Charlotte, sold them, and decided to become a Michigander. I'd never been a Michigander before. I grew up in Chicago, so the weather is no big deal, and palm trees are overrated, especially this time of the year. So she would say, okay, so what are we going to do about, and fill in the blank. She's a night person. I'm a morning person. Well, what would I say when she would ask a question like that? I would say, we'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. And for the most part, we figured it out. She was a single woman for 57 years, and dinner time was not necessarily a sacred time. I mean, when you're living by yourself and you're a busy person, dinner might be popcorn at 4:30 in the afternoon. You don't get out the tablecloth and napkins and place settings and so forth. You do what you can, right? You just keep up with your hunger. Well, Nancy wasn't going to do that. So, but she's saying, okay, now what are we going to do about meal times? And what do I say? We'll figure that out. So again, I go to sleep. I'm really 9 o'clock at night. Forgive me if this really sounds wussy, but 9 o'clock at night, I'm about done because I get up really early. So that's my deal. Well, guess what? Nancy, that's not her program. So she would say, early in our marriage, or even when we were engaged, she would say, okay, so I'm night people, you're morning people. What are we going to do? I've never done this. I'm 57, never married, never had, whiskers in the sink. What am I going to do? I would say, we'll figure this out. Well, so you got Adam, and he knows that he's sinning. And he says to himself, it's a great deception. I'll figure this out. In fact, again, we did some homework on this and prayed about it. And most theologians, it'd be fun to ask you what you think, believe that during the conversation between the serpent and Eve, Adam was right there. Because it says, the scripture says, Genesis 3, she took of the fruit and ate it, gave it to her husband, and he did too. He ate it as well. So unless she threw it across the garden, she probably just handed it to him, which means he was right there. So men tend to say, I'll figure this out. And they also tend to be passive. So, for example, when Nancy and I got married, her mother said, "Oh, honey, just do a destination wedding." And, when you're 57 and 67, you have a Rolodex. Now, some of your listeners are going, "What is a Rolodex?" Well, you've got a lifetime of friendships. So how do you put together an invitation list? So we had, instead of a destination wedding, we had a significant wedding. So we're planning the wedding, and I got an idea, Kirby. I got an idea. And I've never seen this before, and maybe some guys have stolen this from me. I hope they have. But typically, the father of the bride brings the bride all the way down to the altar where the nervous groom is standing. Well, we decided to not do that. First, Nancy lost her daddy in 1979.
Oh, yeah.
So on her 21st birthday, Art DeMoss stepped into heaven. So her brother Mark, who's been a friend of mine for many, many years, brought her down the aisle. But when he got halfway down, he stopped. And I'm standing at the altar, and I walked halfway down the aisle and met her there.
Very good.
And the big idea was what I'm talking about right now. The danger, I think, from we men is to just stand back and be passive, to not step in, not speak up. In fact, I'm sure a lot of guys get in trouble, again, knowing that they're in trouble, but not stepping up and saying, "You know what, this is a problem," whether with buddies, college age, grown men, whatever. So passivity, another big problem. And those two things, we'll figure this out. And the danger toward passivity is not purely, but a predominantly male characteristic. And so I began writing this book with those two things in mind, and really encouraging men to not sin just thinking we're going to figure this out. The consequences of sin are inevitable. It's not negotiable. Now, that's the other thing you and I think we can do. We can negotiate, right? All of us at some point are salespeople, are salesmen, and we'll figure we'll talk our way out of it somehow. Well, get over that. Sin is sin, and you won't, even if you figure it out, the consequences between now and then could be too grave to even consider.
Incredible.
And then the other part is dare to step up. Don't be passive. And that is, as your kids are growing, so let's be a dad now, not just a man. Let's be a father. And you're watching your children. When they're little and portable, you speak into their lives. But they grow and they become less portable, and they're big, and your teenage boy may be taller than you. And so you can be intimidated by him. That's not an uncommon thing for a father to step away from his role as the dad, as the father.
Again, your goal is to step into it. I need to take one of those mandatory breaks, but when we come back, we'll get a little bit more of your insight in the book, Lies Men Believe and the Truth That Sets Them Free. It is published by our friends at Moody, and we have information about it. You may already have been able to find it in your bookstore, but it's also available on our website, and we'll be right back.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Robert Wolgemuth. He is the author of the book Lies Men Believe. It's been out for a while, and you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link so that you can get it in hardback or Kindle. Talks about lies that men believe about God, about themselves, about sin, sexuality, marriage and family, work and wealth, circumstances, as well as lies men believe about the world, and has a whole section on countering the lies with the truth. And Robert, you were talking about the origin of these lies, and these have such a profound impact. You catalog 40 different lies, and even if you only believe a few of those, it can really begin to damage your Christian walk, can't it?
Oh, absolutely. A hole in a boat is a hole in a boat. It doesn't take 40 holes to make it go down. So, yes, absolutely, every one of them. And, by the power of the Holy Spirit, Kerby, I may get to a place where I feel like I've got a sense of victory over a sin that I had been believing. And then the Lord says, you know what? Here's another one. And here's another place for you to grow. Here's another place that's going to humble you because you think you've got it together and you don't. So here's another lie that you need to fix. You need to work on. You find yourself on your knees confessing whatever it is that you've been believing. And it's important. This is not lies men tell. We have that problem too. But it's lies men believe. So it's about the culture. It's about access to lies. I mean, who would have thought 50 years ago or 30 years ago or 10 years ago that we would be so inundated with information? You flip on your smartphone or you lift up the cover of your laptop, and what percentage of what you're reading isn't true? It's unbelievable. And you don't have to go anywhere to see it. It's right there. It invites itself into your brain, into your heart. So, yeah, this is Ephesians 6, isn't it? This is the whole armor of God.
Yes.
To be able to withstand the wiles of the devil. And he's everywhere, and he's relentless. And he's not going to be satisfied if I just conquer one sin or one lie. He's going to stay after me, and until he thinks he's victorious over my life. And by the power of the Holy Spirit, I don't want him to get there. So, again, in humility, I find myself desperate for the Word and for truth, and for friends who speak truth into my life. How many of the people that we've referred to a while back, pastors who fall, whatever, when they're interviewed afterward, first of all, they thought they were going to be able to figure this out and walk or talk their way out of it. But many of these guys confess to not having a friend who speaks truth to them. So, what's that worth? What's it worth to have a friend who says, that just doesn't sound right. I heard what you said last night. I heard the language that you used. I heard the way you spoke to your wife. That's a problem.
Yes.
That's a friend who loves you, right?
A friend that sticks closer to the brother, as they say in the Proverbs.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And sometimes brothers are crummy. So I've been gifted with good brothers, but sometimes it's even better than a brother.
Yes.
The guy who says, you know what? I'm not going to be intimidated by you. I'm not going to be afraid to speak the truth. Here it is.
Let me get to one of the issues you raised just a few minutes ago, and that is male passivity. We really haven't talked about this too much, maybe back years ago when we had Patrick Morley on, but in Chapter 6, you have a whole section here about I don't have what it takes to be the CEO of my home. I can leave that role to my wife. I don't have to grow up. I don't have to discipline my kids. After all, they'll rebel. That is a problem that I appreciate you addressing early on in the book, and it's something that surfaces again in Chapter 6. Speak to that, if you might.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's interesting. Let me just, I know I'm going to sound like a politician because I'm going to not answer your question, but you're going to think I'm going to answer your question. But I thought of something, and I don't want to miss it, and it does answer your question and others that maybe your listeners have. If you go to the back of the book, I don't know if you've got a copy there with you.
I do, right here.
If you go back to page 267, because the truth is that the title of this book, and it's the larger letters on the cover, are Lies Men Believe. But the most important, or the more important thing to read on the cover is the subtitle, the truth that sets us free, right?
Yes.
So if you go to page 267, 269. What you see there is all the 40 lies. And this is a great, guys, there are churches that we've heard from who take all their men through lies men believe and their ladies through lies women believe. But this becomes sort of the
answer. Yeah.
The schematic for going through this, because
yes, very good.
Instead of emphasizing the truth, it emphasizes, the lies, it emphasizes the truth and takes men to the Word of God. That, at the end of the day, that's really what matters. If this book gets men into the Word, it's been successful. I don't really care what I think. I don't want them to enjoy my writing and enjoy the stories that I tell and the metaphors I use and the analogies and whatever. What really is important is that they're inspired to get into God's Word, because that's where the truth is. And so this section takes each one of these lies and sort of goes behind the scenes and says, this is where the truth really comes from. This is where you can find God's truth as it relates to this particular lie.
And I love the verses that you have there, because some of those are ones that would be familiar, obviously in Ephesians and other passages, but some of the verses here are ones probably people have not run into before, and they're in a little more obscure area, and it just, again, helps us understand how to find answers to all these lies and how to, if you want, to even memorize some scriptures that really provide an opportunity for you to have that armor that you need to have on your life so that you don't fall into that sin once again.
Absolutely. And it's, you hear stories about POWs and guys who try to recall things that they had memorized before they were incarcerated, before they were put in prison, whatever. Whatever you can hide in your heart is a great antidote to sin, right? And it's unbelievable how the Lord, in fact, okay, so the last time you were trying to figure out if there are 30 days in September or 31 days in September, you did 30 days have September, April, June, and November. All the rest have 31 except February, right?
Yep.
That's the way we memorize.
That's what we
how
do.
To spell encyclopedia. How to spell encyclopedia. Jiminy Cricket taught us that 50 years ago. I don't mean to be silly or lighthearted, but honestly, take the time. In fact, what you're inspiring me to do is convicting me of is I've been so busy. I used to have, and I still do, cards in my briefcase that when I'm traveling and waiting in airports for planes to board, I'd take those cards out and I'd memorize scripture. So I'm going to, between you and me, Kerby, and whoever else is listening, I'm going to pick that one back up. I need to. I memorized Psalm 139 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
For my wedding, I memorized 1 Corinthians 13. And, at our age, it's not as easy to memorize, right? When your kids are little and you teach them, they memorize because their cement is wet.
They just pick it up so fast. Yeah.
And it's harder for us to memorize. But you're right. It's hiding God's Word in our heart because we got this problem. It's called sin.
One of the things I appreciate there, too, even looking at page 269, like you were talking about, nothing is too grand or too insignificant for God's care. He made me and is involved in every detail of my life, large and small. Robert, one of the things I find is you talk to a man and you even say, well, I'm sure God is concerned about you. They tend to react just exactly like you have in there. God isn't actually involved in or concerned with the details of my life. That is something that I think a lot of Christian men, they say, oh, yeah, I know lilies of the field and the birds of the air and everything, but I just don't think God cares about the details of my life. And so to have that verse, a couple of verses there from Psalm 37 and Psalm 139, which you just mentioned a minute ago, and to have some of the, if you will, responses and, as you said, schematics and foundations for all of that is helpful, because most guys maybe won't verbalize that, but they pretty much believe it in a pretty much significant way. And that's one of the ways in which sin enters into your world, because you think, oh, God doesn't really care that much what I watch on television tonight or what I watch on my iPhone, because, he's up there, he's got bigger problems than me. And that kind of opens the door for sin, doesn't it?
There's an old gospel song, and I can't help but to default to stuff like this, but the opening line is, I cannot hide from God. And so you say to an 18-year-old boy, would you rather have her dad ride along in the car? Or would you rather just be you and her? Well, of course, no 18-year-old boy with red blood coursing through his veins is going to say, well, I'd rather have her dad ride along. All of us don't want that. We rather, it's Joseph in Egypt. Here's this kid who goes to Egypt, doesn't know anyone. I mean, it's the ultimate business trip. I'm not accountable to anyone. Oh, yes, you are. And, I think there are times, again, because we're sinners and our hearts are drawn towards sinful things and sinful thoughts, that we'd rather not be accountable. We'd rather not have a God in our lives who cares enough to pay attention to what's up and what we're doing and what we're saying and what we're thinking and how we're speaking, all those things. I'd rather be an isolated person. I'd rather be an island and do whatever I want to do. That's what then draws my heart toward. And this is the antidote for that.
Lies Men Believe. Robert Wolgemuth. We'll continue with him right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, the book is entitled, again, Lies Men Believe, and back to the point we made just a minute ago, and the truth that sets them free. 40 different lies, but also 40 different antidotes, biblical answers to those questions, with a lot of verses that I would encourage you to look at, to memorize, and to consider. And just before we get into how people can use this book, I thought, Robert, I'd bring up one other point. When we were talking about the fact that God doesn't care, it also surfaces a lot in one of the chapters you have on chapter 7 about my faith and my work are unrelated. We have this idea, and we've talked about this before on the program, kind of this sacred and secular split that says, well, God's concerned, and I, as a Christian, I will be concerned about how I raise my family, maybe what I do in church, But when I go into the boardroom, when I go into the courtroom, when I go into the classroom, when I go into the press room, whatever it might be, I am going to just be like everyone else. And that is another one of those really significant lies that not only men but women have adopted. And one of the reasons why Christianity, I think, is not making the kind of impact in the 21st century that God would intend.
Yes, it's so easy to be intimidated by the culture and by social pressure. You know, we tell our teenagers not to succumb to that. But as you just said, as grown-ups, we're also potentially victimized by not stepping up, by not being salt and light. And you know, I'm going to say something that might surprise you, Kerby, but it really isn't that hard. It's like people who say, "Well, you know I should witness." It really isn't that hard. It's not that hard to stand for truth. Now, you know, you may be afraid that you're going to lose your job or somebody's going to mock you or whatever, but one of the things, in fact, I'm going to tell you that my marriage to Nancy Lee DeMoss was one of the greatest joys of my entire life, and I was happily married for 43 years to Bobby. She was a precious lady. But Nancy's boldness, like toward the latter years of her life, as she was dying, Bobby became far bolder in terms of her witness. But this is Nancy's DNA. You know, you'll see Nancy stopping anywhere and praying with somebody in the parking lot of the grocery store. It's unbelievable. So what we do, and this is blending the ordinary with the sacred in so many different ways. We'll say, "How can we pray for you?" Or tell us your story. In fact, the book we just released 2 days ago is about God writing our story. And nobody ever says, "No, you can't pray for me." No, I don't want you to pray for me. Don't ask me about my life. I don't want to tell you my story. You know, it's honestly, it's just taking that first step. In fact, it's so interesting. Romans chapter 1, the Apostle Paul saying, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel." Well, he wouldn't have written that if he hadn't experienced what I'm talking about right now. You know, the apprehension of being ashamed, of being intimidated, of being nervous, of being afraid to witness. You know, the truth is, it's actually easy. You know, I'm sorry for the years, the decades I spent not being bold for Christ. You know, whether you're riding in a rental car shuttle and you got 5 minutes with the guy sitting next to you, you start the conversation. You say, "Well, tell me where you're from. Where's home for you? Do you go to church anywhere?" Boy, that's an important. Whatever it is, people not only do they not reject it, they welcome it. And I think I'm going to say 99% of the time, if you're bold for Christ, if you speak up, whether it's in the workplace or on the playground or at the ball field in the grandstands as your kids are playing out there, it's an incredibly wonderful thing to do, to carry the gospel in everything that you do and say. In fact, when Nancy and I pray early in the morning, actually, she's barely awake and I'm getting ready to get up, we pray. I put my face next to her and I say, "Father, we pray that you would guide us today, everything we do and say and think." That's the kind of man I want to be.
Very good. Let me just real quickly, since you did mention the book, it has been out just a couple of days, and I want people to look for it and would love to do an interview on it as well. You Can Trust God to Write Your Story, Embracing the Mysteries of Providence. And what you have done over these many years has been able to observe and experience God's providence in all what essentially are the twists and turns of your own lives. And so in some respects, you've used some of those stories and those narratives as a very effective witnessing tool and a way in which to really begin to discover God's hand in your life in a way that maybe you had never seen before.
It's true. It's true. And the truth is that, as I said a moment ago, everybody has a story. And so you ask people, "Well, tell me your story." And so this book includes, in fact, Nancy and I have collected stories from people, and every one of the people we interviewed are people we know. So we didn't do some kind of blind survey. Every person, every couple, every person we talked to are friends of ours. In fact, if you look at the table of contents for this book, it's "You can trust God when your marriage is in trouble. You can trust God when you long for a mate. You can trust God when you're pressed financially. I tell the story about losing my business, my net worth going to zero when I lost my business in 1992.
Yeah.
Nancy writes about losing her daddy on her 21st birthday weekend, or her home burning down when she was a teenager. And so, is that an accident? Does God go, oh, how did that happen? Why? I wasn't paying attention. I'm sorry. No, God knows exactly what he's doing, and we can trust him, even through the difficult times. So even our story, I met Nancy professionally, and then I lost Bobby in 2014, and before she died, she told two friends, this is my late wife, she told two friends that she wants Robert to marry Nancy Lee DeMoss. But she never told me that.
That's amazing.
So I knew Nancy professionally, as I said, and 2 months after we were dating, those two friends said, well, this is exactly what Bobby wanted you.
What she said.
So you can trust God to write your story. What can I say?
And again, I might just mention that one has an endorsement from Randy Alcorn's been on the program with us, forward by Johnny Erickson Todd, of course, been on the program, and that is also published by Moody. It is just now coming out, so it may just be now arriving in your bookstore, but we'll have information about that. And Robert, just before we go, we also have put a link to your website, robertwolgemuth.com. You'll have a hard last name to spell, but that's okay. All they have to do is click on your picture. It will take them there. And so it gives information about the books, the blog, and a way in which people can follow you. As a matter of fact, next to your picture there, we've got a number of things. We've got your link to your Facebook page, a link to your website, a link to Twitter feed. And so there's just a lot of great resources, and we've posted those on the website. And so thank you so very much for not only writing this book, but I remember the days of Wolgemuth and Hyatt and all the involvement that you had for those years, and it's just been great to have your friendship. So thank you for joining us today on Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby, man. It's just great to hear your voice, and look forward to seeing you down the road together.
Looking forward to the next opportunity. Let me again mention the book that has been out actually for quite a number of months, Lies Men Believe and the Truth That Sets Them Free. Might just mention forward by Patrick Morley, and forward and endorsements by all sorts of people that you would know. And for those of you women that have benefited from the Nancy Lee DeMoss, now Nancy DeMoss Wolgemuth, Lies Women Believe, you will certainly benefit from this book, as well as, if nothing else, because it would help you understand men, and certainly the men in your life will understand. And then just 2 days ago, I think it has been, September 3rd, actually, is when the release of this book, You Can Trust God to Write Your Story, Embracing the Mysteries of Providence, and it's written by Nancy and Robert. Maybe we'll get them on in the future. An endorsement by Randy Alcorn, also forward by Johnny Erickson Tada. So some great resources that I think you will benefit from, and you can find all of that information on our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. I have a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour I want to spend some time talking about debt in a variety of different ways, and the reason I'm doing that is multifaceted. The first is we have a booklet on the subject of debt, which we've made available to individuals, so that is reason enough. But more importantly, it is a topic that doesn't get mentioned very often. If you think about it, in the 2016 election, neither presidential candidate spent much time talking about that. There aren't a whole lot of members of Congress that are talking about this, and yet even though we bring up the fact that we have $22 trillion in debt, heading towards $23 trillion in debt, nothing seems to be changing and no action seems to be taken. And we are in that situation in terms of government debt. So I want to spend some time in this first segment talking about that. But then I want to spend most of our time talking about consumer debt, personal debt, auto loan debt, student loan debt, because this is what is certainly been affecting you as an individual, affecting your family. Quite frankly, it's also affecting the churches. A little bit later, I'm going to talk about how giving to Christian organizations, giving to churches, giving to mission organizations has declined because if people are in debt, they don't have the kind of opportunity to give towards the Lord's work. So there are a lot of implications to this whole idea of debt. But let me, for a few minutes at least, talk about what the government is dealing with, and oftentimes, and I'm saying dealing with hypothetically because most people aren't really addressing the issue. And of course, the government is in about $22 trillion in debt. And that amount, if that helps put this in perspective, is more than the gross domestic product of the United States. That alone should concern you. If your debt as an individual was more than your annual income, you would think you were in a really bad situation. Of course, you don't have the ability to print money or borrow money the way the federal government does, but it's a source of some concern. In one of the articles that I wrote recently, and by the way, I'm going to just a few minutes talk about how you can get some of this material free of charge. We have it on our website. It's from one of our Outlook magazines. It came out a number of months ago. I point out that I, more than a decade ago, wrote about my concern that we might eventually have a national debt that would reach $20 trillion by the year 2020. Well, as you can see, we hit $22 trillion long before we got to the year 2020. And even then pointed out the fact that that would probably have been 90% of the gross domestic product. So the point is that when I was writing about this a decade ago in my Viewpoints commentary, I was already concerned about what it would be like if we were $20 trillion in debt. Well, we're $22 trillion in debt, and nobody seems to be talking about it, although we're talking about it today here on Point of View. So some people have said that the whole issue is like the sword of Damocles hanging over the head of every American, and it's going to have some impact. How so? First, the issue of foreign investment. When our debt load exceeds our annual income, there's a number of things that start happening because, as I pointed out, you can imagine what it's like if your credit card debt is larger than your annual income. You can think of college students who have a student loan debt that's more than they'll be able to make for years in various jobs. But let's look at it in terms of what it means for the government. First, the very large debt load is certain sometime in the future, if not immediately, certainly in the future, to scare away foreign investors. and various individuals who in the past have been called upon to finance our debt. If you think about this, one way that some people put this is if the United States were to right now ask to be admitted into the European Union, there is a question as to whether or not the various countries in the European Union would actually be willing to admit the United States into the European Union, given its economic structure and its debt load. And so you have to understand that a lot of the debt that we have is debt that is owned by other individuals. One of the arguments that used to be made all the time, and since I've been doing this broadcast for more than 3 decades, I can remember back in the 1980s, we used to have people say, well, I'm not concerned about $1 trillion or $2 trillion in debt. Boy, does that seem like so little now, because we owe it to ourselves. But the reality is that really since the 1980s, a good significant amount, a very large significant amount of our debt is owned by people in other countries. Guess who? The Chinese. You know, when we talk about these trade wars and we talk about some of the conflict between the United States and China, they do control us in part because, after all, those are the individuals who don't necessarily like us, who own and have a fairly significant amount of debt. One former member of Congress put it this way: whoever pays the piper gets to call the tune, and foreign leaders aren't inclined to whistle Yankee Doodle. So that's the first concern. The second problem is these countries, even if they are our friends, and many of them are, they don't have an infinite source of credit. They have their own economies to deal with. Right now, the economic situation in the European Union isn't so good. And so they may want to put their investments closer to home, especially if they see Congress heading out on another huge spending spree. And some of the candidates right now have certainly been talking about that. And so the question we're asking is, are we approaching a time when this excessive borrowing could make the United States a bad credit risk? And so that is certainly one concern. The United States, we estimate, probably has China owning about 1.5, or perhaps as much as 1.1. It's kind of hard to tell how much trillion of our debt. Saudi Arabia had another $700 billion in assets. And these are concerns because you might remember when President Barack Obama was in office, one of the things the Saudis threatened at one time was to sell off some of their treasuries. And you could see that we get ourselves in a very difficult and tenuous situation when indeed some of these foreign countries own our debt. So these countries up until now have been lending America money that they may not want to invest in America in the future. They may decide for very good reasons, including their own economic health, to withdraw some of their investments. And as they begin to do that, they would then, of course, put us in a difficult situation. So the first issue is, of course, foreign influence. When we come back from the break, I want to talk about a couple of others real quickly, and that is the economic debt bomb, because if indeed interest rates go up, a lot of what we spend in terms of the federal government is interest on the debt. Well, and the interest is only a penny or a cent or 2 or 3%, not a big deal. But if it goes up more, that becomes what's called the economic debt bomb. And then I also want to address one other issue, because I've always heard people say, well, we owe it to ourselves. Or some people say, well, yeah, but it's good debt, not bad debt. I mean, after all, if you have debt on your house and your house is appreciating, that's probably a good debt. Very different than a credit card debt because you don't have anything to show for it. So are the debts that we owe as a government good debt or bad debt? And then we'll get into some of the issues of personal debt as well. So a lot of things to cover here, and I feel the need to cover it simply because so few others are talking about it. So we'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the opioid crisis is getting worse, but there is also good evidence that solving this crisis will require careful strategies because the problem is more complex than many might imagine. First, let's look at the crisis. Americans are showing up in emergency rooms from opioid overdoses in record numbers. According to the CDC, suspected opioid overdoses increased by 30% from July 2016 to September 2017. But as soon as you look at the statistics in various states, you see how complex this issue is to solve with a simple solution. For example, prescription opioids are driving the epidemic in some states. In other states, illicit opioids are driving the epidemic, and in a few states, it is both. That is only part of the complexity. Opioids, when used correctly, can be highly effective pain medications. They can make the difference between a functional life and a dysfunctional life. Jacob Sullum writes about how doctors are tired of the scrutiny and have booted all of their opioid patients and relegated them to a pain-racked existence. His article in Reason magazine challenges the current perception that the use of opioids always leads to addiction and death. He explains that opioid-related deaths do not usually involve drug-naive patients who accidentally get hooked while being treated for pain. Instead, they usually involve people with histories of substance abuse and psychological problems who use multiple drugs, not just opioids. He argues that we should not conflate the two groups, opioid addicts and patients using opioids responsibly under a doctor's care. We need wise and careful policies to both treat the epidemic, but also help patients dealing with chronic pain. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
My topic this hour is debt, and we've been talking about government debt. I want to say a little bit more about that, then move on to personal and consumer debt. But let me just mention real quickly, if you go to our website, pointofview.net, I think some of you might say, I'd like some of the facts and figures that you're going to be mentioning today. And this is an Outlook article, series of articles that I'm going to be quoting from. And our Outlook magazine in May actually addressed this issue. So the first section that I'm talking about here is the section on government debt. And then I'll be looking in just a few minutes on personal debt. And then we'll be drawing some material from one of my books, Making the Most of Your Money in Tough Times. And, of course, we have a booklet on debt as well. So if you find yourself saying, I'd like a little more information, I'd like to share this with my member of Congress, I'd like to share this with my family, I'd like to think about how to get myself out of debt, or I'd like to maybe reorganize my priorities, this Outlook magazine is something we're making available to you free. Simply go to pointofview.net, and there's a section where it says Point of View Outlook Magazine, the National and Personal Debt Crisis in America. Get my free copy. And we are glad to make that available to you. It's at pointofview.net, and I would hope that you would take the time to do so. If you're not already a donor to Point of View, I might just mention that this is one of the benefits that come from supporting us. And in the future, we're going to have our Truth Team Week, where we're going to focus on some of the financial needs that we have. And if you join with us in the Truth Team for as little as, say, $1 a day, $30 a month, you will receive that automatically in the mail. For those of you that have received it in the past but say, I can't find my copy, I don't know where I put it, we're glad to send you another copy, and it's available at pointofview.net. Let me, if I can, finish this conversation about government debt, because the rest of our time We're going to talk about your own personal debt. But again, as I mentioned, when we talk about government debt, the first concern, of course, is foreign investment in America and the impact that that might have. But a second one that I wanted to address is what I call the economic debt bomb, because what we are talking about is a situation in which, because we owe so much, we have to pay interest on the debt. Now, the interest rates have been relatively low, but they're much higher than they were before, and as a result, probably will go higher. Let's use the 8 years of President Obama's administration to illustrate the point. When President Obama took office in 2009, the national debt at that time was $12 trillion, and the amount held by the public was $7 trillion, and I'm rounding down on both of those. When he left office, the national debt was $20 trillion, with $14 trillion held in the public. The way in which that didn't completely devastate the Obama administration and the economy was due to the fact that even though the debt was going up significantly, but at the same time, the interest rates were very low. But that is, I think, something that is part of the past. When the interest rates were low and kept from skyrocketing during the skyrocketing debt, it didn't put too much of a financial burden on the federal budget. Let's look ahead to 2020. By that time, the national debt will probably be $23 trillion, with approximately $18 trillion held by the public. And that's a reasonable estimate from the Congressional Budget Office. And when the interest rate was 1%, well, the cost of servicing that debt was significant, but not overwhelming. But now that the interest rate is, 3 times higher, and probably will go higher, you can see the possible concerns that this might have. Matter of fact, one Congressional Budget Office scenario for next year, the year of 2020, predicted that over half of all the personal income taxes would be required just to service the national debt. In fact, the annual debt service in that year, if that trend continues, will exceed our Social Security obligations. So you can see we've got some real problems. These are questions, by the way, to ask before we go any further, of individuals that keep telling us that we need to spend more. Whether it's Democrats who really want to go on a spending spree, at least those running for the presidency keep coming up with all sorts of ways in which we can spend even more money than we're spending right now. But even many Republicans as well will say, well, we'll just spend this, or we'll put this project on hold, but we'll spend money on another project. You just got to begin to ask yourself the question, what kind of resources do we have left in order to fund some of those? And economist Paul Samuelson reminds us that really the problem facing America can also be found in the world economy, which he estimates to have a debt load of about $247 trillion. So it isn't like there's another country that could even bail us out, assuming a country would want to do that, because they have problems of their own because they're spending more than they're taking in. Which brings me to one last point before we take a break, and that is good debt or bad debt. You know, one of the things we've heard over the years is that a debt is not bad if my guys are in the administration. And so I'll point out that, for example, when George W. Bush was president, there were people that voiced concern in his cabinet meetings about, well, what about tax cuts? Would this lead to larger federal deficits? And allegedly, Vice President Dick Cheney replied by saying, well, deficits don't matter. Well, interesting enough, then when President Barack Obama was in office, you have economist Paul Krugman writing for the New York Times. Man, by the way, is an economist who actually wrote that debt is good. And because he has a Nobel Prize to his credit, it was easy to believe that he settled the discussion. But it's interesting how his tune changed the moment President Trump took office. And that's kind of been the scenario more recently. And here's something I've mentioned before on the air, but it's worth mentioning again. Most political commentators won't tell you this. When economists like the president in office, the national debt isn't a big deal. When they dislike the president in office, the national debt is a catastrophe. Sadly, of course, the national debt goes up year after year, whether we have a Republican president or a Democratic president, whether we have Congress controlled by Republicans or Democrats. Now, to be fair, Democrats tend to spend more and faster than Republicans, but you really have to go back a long, long way in American economic history to find a time in which we balanced the budget. The closest we've come in recent times happened in the 1990s when they claimed that they balanced the budget, and this happened under the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, and President Bill Clinton. But even those weren't really balanced because they were borrowing from the Social Security Trust Fund. But that's the closest we've come to anything that looked even like a balanced budget. And that, of course, was in the 1990s. You have to go back even further than that before you find a government that actually balances its budget. So interestingly enough, the argument being made by Paul Krugman, I'll get back to that, was that issuing debt is a way to pay for useful things. And we should do more of that when the price is right. He says the United States suffers obvious deficiencies in roads, rails, water systems, and more meaningfully, the federal government can borrow at historic low rates. And so his argument was, just a few years ago, actually debt might be a good thing because we can rebuild the roads and rails and water systems, and the interest rates are low. And while that might have been true when we had low interest rates, first of all, that's no longer the case. But here's the bigger problem. Most of the money being spent by the federal government is not being used to build infrastructure. You know, those so-called shovel-ready projects turned out not to be quite so shovel-ready after all. In most cases, we were borrowing money to fund social services. So again, good debt, bad debt. As we get into the whole issue of your own personal debt, borrowing money to fix up your house, probably really a good investment, especially if someday you decide to sell your house for more money. Borrowing to fix up your house is very different than borrowing money to use on your credit card to buy an expensive meal that is here today and gone tomorrow. So again, you can see that we are, as a country, been running into debt and borrowing more and more money. That is not a good prescription for the future. So when we come back from the break, I want to move from government debt to personal debt. And that is to recognize that just as we recognize America as a country is in debt, so Americans are in debt as well. And what does the Bible have to say about this? What are the different types of debt that we find individuals into? And certainly, I hope that this would encourage you to get out of debt, because certainly the scriptures are very clear that indeed when you are in debt, in Proverbs 22:7, it says the rich rule over the poor and the borrower is a servant to the lender. Probably better translated, a borrower is a slave to the lender. Get yourself out of slavery, get yourself out of debt. We'll talk more about that right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again talking about the subject of debt. And let me just mention that one of the resources I wanted to provide to you free of charge, it is the Outlook magazine, and some of you may have already received it if you're a donor to Point of View. Came out in May, but you may have misplaced it or you'd like to find it again. This is a PDF which we can send out, and all you have to do is go to pointofview.net, click on that button there that says Point of View Outlook magazine, the national and personal debt crisis in America. If by chance some of you say, well, I don't have a computer or I don't know how to read it on a PDF and I'd like to get a printed copy, I'm sure you can just give us a call or leave a note. And of course, you're very familiar with the fact that we do provide resources to you so that you can contact us. And if you'd like to get a copy, like to make that available to you, because this is an issue that deserves more attention. And that's why I'm giving you an opportunity to not only read these magazine articles, but also to apply them to your life. We spent some time talking about the government. Let's talk about personal debt, because as I said just a minute ago, not only is America as a country in debt, but Americans themselves are in debt. And that's because of choices they've made about consumer goods, lifestyle choices, educational opportunities. Debt isn't necessarily wrong, but the level of personal debt indebtedness today should be of concern to so many. I cannot overemphasize the significant impact of debt on our society. It has been, as we've documented before with some of our economic advisors that have been on this program, the leading cause for divorce. It's a reason for many troubled marriages. It's one of the causes for depression as well as suicide. And the level of personal indebtedness in this country is a relatively recent phenomenon. Matter of fact, I spent some time in my book, Making the Most of Your Money in Tough Times, talking about some of the history, because less than a century ago, you didn't even really have anything that were like credit cards. Yes, you could go into the general store and say, put it on my tab, and people would eventually pay that, but that was pretty unusual. We did not have credit cards. Mortgages were pretty much unusual there as well. Some of those began to proliferate more when GIs returned from the war, but you have to recognize that it was a relatively recent 20th century and now 21st century phenomenon about that. And so as a result, we are dealing with a level of indebtedness in America and in many other countries around the world that is unprecedented. There are some countries where debt is not as encouraged as it is here, and where savings is encouraged, and I've used some of those examples on the air, but that certainly doesn't seem to be what we find here in the country of the United States or in many of the European countries right now. So what does the Bible have to say about debt before we get into the different forms of debt? Just a minute ago, I read from Proverbs 22, verse 7, the rich rule over the poor, but the borrower is a servant to the lender. And if you think about this, the Bible says quite a bit about money. Many of the parables that Jesus uses are about money. And certainly there is the idea that when you borrow money and you are then in debt, you're putting yourself in a situation where the lender has a greater influence over you. If you're looking for some other verses, there are certainly some that we can talk about in the Proverbs, which are certainly replete with lots of examples. In this particular article that I've written about your personal debt, I talk about Proverbs 17, Proverbs 22, Proverbs 27, and others. And so we can certainly see that we are warned about going into debt. Now, the other day I did mention on the air that some people have maybe misinterpreted at least one passage in the New Testament, and that is in Romans 13, verse 8. It says, Paul says to the church there in Rome, owe nothing to anyone. And so that has been a teaching that some churches have used to say, well, that means that Christians could never go into debt. And although some have tried to argue that this verse prohibits debt, you really need to see it in the context, because the passage is really not so much a specific teaching about debt, but rather kind of this idea that we have a duty as Christians to government authority. And more importantly, I've said as well that if the Bible really were to prohibit debt, then why does the Bible say so much about debt? I mean, as a matter of fact, it talks about various principles that you would use in terms of debt. So I think you can recognize that it's probably a misunderstanding of that verse to do so. And there is also, I think, a very important distinction we should make between debt and credit. We made a distinction a minute ago between so-called good debt and bad debt, but credit is very different. Often in our society, the two words are used interchangeably, but debt is something that is owed, and the Bible does not prohibit borrowing. It certainly does not recommend it, but credit is the establishment of a mutual trust between a lender and a borrower. We could argue that some people even actually end up in debt to do no fault of their own. They've been swindled in a business. They have made a good faith attempt to start a business, but were unsuccessful. They might have been cheated out by a supplier. They may have been unfairly sued in court. They may have had to go into debt to care for a loved one. So I recognize that debt doesn't necessarily mean a moral failing, but it does mean that it does put you in a very difficult set of circumstances. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to address it as well. What are some of the kinds of debt? Well, the first would be credit card debt. You know, I've said before that as Americans sometimes criticize the federal government for going into debt, they might want to look at their own credit card statements, because now the estimates are that the credit card debt for Americans in general is about $1 trillion. Matt Schultz, who is the senior industry analyst for creditcards.com, says that the record should serve as a wake-up call to Americans to focus on their credit card debt. He even adds that even if you feel your debt is manageable right now, know that you could be one unexpected emergency away from real trouble. And that kind of reminds me of something I wrote about years ago in terms of a study that was done by the Federal Reserve Board. They actually surveyed Americans, and they asked respondents how would they pay for a $400 emergency. And they found that 47% of respondents said they would cover that expense by either borrowing or selling something. In other words, the argument was they couldn't come up with $400 any other way. Now, in a very insightful article that appeared in The Atlantic by Neil Gabler, he said, "Who knew?" You know, and then he answers, "I knew because I was one of them. I found that every time I would have new bills, I didn't have a check to pay for them." And so he said you could look at his resume as a writer and even conclude he was doing fine. He was in the middle class, even the upper middle class, with 5 books and hundreds of articles. But he called this the shame of the middle class. And one of the financial analysts even said you're more likely to hear from your buddy that he's using Viagra than the fact that he has credit card problems. And so back to our article that appeared in Outlook, when you start looking at this situation, you recognize that many Americans are borrowing, but they're not paying it off. It's one thing to have a credit card and pay it off every month, but more than half, 55%, don't regularly pay off their credit card in full. Even greater concern is that about 37 million credit card accounts had a 90-plus day delinquency mark as a result to their credit report last quarter. And the credit card debt seems to be increasing while the incomes of Americans are increasing. So that brings us back to whether or not we're living within our means. Something else that was kind of interesting, credit card debt increases by age. The average credit card debt for Americans under 35 years of age is about $5,000 plus, but 45 to 54 is about $9,000 plus. So you can see over time that increases rather dramatically. And the average American consumer owns usually at least 3 credit cards, and the average interest that they pay is more than 16%. So that is certainly one of those kinds of debts you want to pay off. But when we come back from the break, I'll talk about a few other of those debts and then conclude with some of the consequences of debt that the scriptures talk about as well. So again, if you would like to find out a little bit more about this issue of debt, maybe this would be something helpful in terms of your own planning, or if you'd like to just maybe use some of these facts and figures to share with your family members or your member of Congress, again, go to our website, pointofview.net. You'll see a banner there that says Point of View Outlook Magazine, the National and Personal Debt Crisis in America. Get your free copy, and all you need to do is give us your name and address and email so we can send the PDF to you. If some of you would like a printed copy, of course, you can contact Point of View there as well, and we would be glad to send one of those out, and certainly encourage you to learn a little bit more about debt and the impact that it is having on your life and on the government. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We have a few more minutes talking about the subject of debt, and if you find yourself saying, I'd like to look at some of the material that you've been reading from and summarizing, you are welcome to go to our website, pointofview.net, and find this particular Outlook magazine in which we focus on the subject of both government debt and personal debt. And in these last few minutes, let me talk about some of the other kinds of debt. Auto loan debt is another one of those issues where you have, again, the collective debt in terms of auto is at about, again, $1 trillion. About half of Americans rely on an auto loan to finance a vehicle. And so that illustrates, again, something that is changing. Back in 2003, about 74 million Americans had auto loans. Now it's 108 million, so that has gone up dramatically. And sadly, millions of auto loans are in delinquency, a fact that sometimes we are, as Americans, taking out loans with repayment periods longer than the time they plan to own the vehicle. And so that obviously illustrates, again, a very bad investment. At least you have something concrete, but it is a depreciating asset, so that's something to think about. And the one that's been in the news quite a bit lately is student loan debt. And the reasons it's in the news is because the amount owed is about $1.5 trillion by more than 44 million borrowers. If you've listened to this program, we've pointed out that when you look at, say, the baby boom generation, or even the so-called baby buster generation, those individuals did take out loans, but it was about a fourth of them did. By the time you get to the millennial generation, it is more than half. And so you can see that, first of all, that is due to the unbelievably skyrocketing cost of higher education. And as a result, the average college student will graduate with $37,000 in student loan, and that's the average. I've certainly seen some that almost go into the six figures. So, and the student loan delinquency rate, I might just mention, that's the so-called default rate, is very significant as well, at least at 10%. And so this is why it's become quite a political issue here in America. Well, we can talk about debt all day, but what about the consequences of debt? How do we get out of debt? Some of the consequences, first of all, of course, I talked about in Proverbs 22, the rich rule over the poor and the borrower is a servant to the lender. It really is a reminder that debt can be slavery. You've always heard the old phrase, I owe, so it's off to work I go. And really, if you're deeply in debt, I mean, it constrains your choices about buying a new car, about moving, about going on a vacation. So that is one of those situations. I do point out in the article that a lot of people that are in debt sort of deny reality. They hope that they're going to win the lottery. They hope that if they just ignore the debt, it will just go away. But probably the greatest concern is just the incredible amount of stress that debt puts into our lives. And so there, I think, is just an incredible need for us to come up with some different ways to begin to get out of debt. And in my book, Making the Most of Your Money in Tough Times, I have a whole section on how to get out of debt. But let me mention just 5 very quick points before we end the program today. And the first is to establish right priorities. How many times when we had a certified financial planner in this studio or somebody by phone, they want to remind us that, first of all, God owns it all. You see this in Psalm 24, in Job 41. And so as a result, sometimes we think that we own it all, but really we are just stewards of the resources God has placed in our hand. And so I think it's really important to recognize that in terms of our debt, in terms of our lifestyle, in terms of our giving, we need to honor the Lord in all that we do. Number 2, stop borrowing. It's really interesting because you have some unbelievable statistics that show that even after sometimes people file bankruptcy, and they, you would think, had learned their lesson from all of the problems they had economically, they maybe last 6 months before they start borrowing again. And I've used the illustration that if a pipe breaks in your house, the first thing you do is shut off the water before you stop mopping it up. Or another illustration is if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. And so that is certainly the case. Don't use your credit card. Don't take out a bank loan. Start thinking about what is the next step. Number 3, of course, is to develop a budget. And there are all sorts of great ministries out there that we've made available to you in the past that help you begin to come together with a budget. You begin by making a list of your monthly expenses. That's your mortgage or your rent, your utilities, it's your groceries, it's your car payments, your credit card bills, all those kinds of things. And then really try to establish some kind of priority for the loans that you want to start to pay off, and try to pay them off in a systematic way. I've suggested sometimes that the priority should be, if you have one set of debt and credit cards or loans that have the highest interest rate, pay those off first. If for no other reason, then that is the one that is probably burdening you the most. If they're all about the same, then maybe there's a value in paying off the smallest one, because then you would have to be able to cross that off the list, and you'd have a sense of success, a sense of momentum going in the right direction. And also, if you find yourself, after you've created a budget, write to your creditor with a repayment plan so that that individual understands that you at least have a realistic budget and you're really trying to address the issue. Number 4, that is, begin to retire your debt. And this is one I was mentioning just a minute ago. If they all are of different rates, then I would want to pay off the highest interest rate first. If they're all comparable, you might want to pay off the smallest one just so you have some level of success. And finally, number 5, develop new spending habits. Because if it was spending that got you into that debt, and sometimes it isn't, sometimes it has to do with health reversals, sometimes it has to do with all sorts of problems that you face because somebody swindled you out of a particular set of circumstances or finances, or you were sued in court or whatever. But if it was spending that got you into the problem, then changing your spending habits will get you out of the problem. And, of course, there's a lot more we can say. Even in an entire hour, we haven't covered all the aspects of debt. But I did want to address it, as I said before, for a couple of reasons. Number 1, because we have this Outlook magazine that we wanted to make available to you, and that is something that you can have access to. Of course, we have this little booklet on debt that we've been making available to our donors. And I think, if nothing else, this is a good illustration of why your support to Point of View will provide you with some of the resources to address some of the very difficult economic circumstances you find yourself in. But more importantly, in the first half of this hour, you heard us talk about government debt. And I think it's about time to start asking some of these individuals that are going to be knocking on your door, sending you letters, making phone calls, wanting you to vote for them. We need to know what they plan to do to get the United States out of debt, because each year the deficit is there. And that means that the national debt grows every single year. And at some point, we are going to find that there are some economic consequences, some very dire economic consequences to not addressing this issue of debt. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to cover some of this. And again, let me encourage you to look at our website today. And you can, first of all, find the Outlook magazine. And that is something we want to make available to you. If you go to the very bottom of the page, there's a search engine there. You can type in the word debt and finance, and you will find many of the other articles we've posted in the past, which I hope will be of use to you as you begin to look at the problems of government debt and your own personal problems of personal debt. So that's all we have for today to address this issue of debt. And I appreciate you listening to Point of View. And if you would like to find more, it's all at our website, pointofview.net.
So when people first hear about Medi-Share, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, Medi-Share is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become Medi-Share members? 2 big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With Medi-Share, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.